6 days ago, at approximately 9:15 in the morning Beijing time, an Iranian diplomatic delegation boarded a China Eastern flight out of Tehran. The destination was not announced, the meeting was not on any public calendar, and according to the reporting later pieced together by officials and journalists across Asia and Europe, that flight was not the beginning of a negotiation. It was the continuation of one that had already been running in total silence for 6 weeks. That is where this story begins, not in Islamabad, not in Washington, not in the triumphant posts that appeared after the ceasefire announcement. It begins with a quiet flight to Beijing, because the real story is not that a ceasefire was announced on the 8th of April. The real story is that China had already decided weeks earlier that this war would end on terms Beijing could live with, and once China touched the money behind the Iranian state, the rest of the war began bending around that decision. That is the single axis of the story. If you miss it, everything else looks like noise. The Pakistani mediation track looks central. Trump's claim of success looks plausible. The collapse of later talks looks like diplomatic confusion. But once you start with the money, the picture changes completely for years. China has been the overwhelming buyer of Iranian oil, not a useful customer, the customer. Estimates from industry tracking firms have repeatedly put China's share at roughly 85. To 90% of Iran's sanctioned crude exports, the barrels move through dark fleet transfers, relabeling, and ship handoffs. On paper, they often stop being Iranian before they reach Chinese refiners. In reality, everyone knows what they are before the war. That flow was worth roughly 1.6 million barrels a day. That number is not just a trade metric. That number pays the Iranian state. That number funds ministries. That number supports subsidies. That number keeps the whole system moving while sanctions grind down everything else. And on the 12th of March, 2 weeks into the war, that number stopped, not gradually, not symbolically stopped. Chinese buyers were quietly told to pause new Iranian contracts and refuse cargoes that could not show secure passage. Beijing did not announce the move. It did not need a dramatic press conference. It simply turned the tap off and let Tehran understand what had happened through the absence of invoices. That is how China applies pressure when it wants to be taken seriously. Not by speeches, by silence attached to cash flow within roughly 72 hours. Iranian oil exports to China collapsed from around 1.6 million barrels a day to under 300,000. That is not a squeeze. That is a financial shock delivered at the exact moment wartime spending was exploding. Inflation was already brutal. And the Iranian system was far more exposed than its public language suggested. That was the pressure that mattered. America had missiles, America had carriers, America had maximalist rhetoric. But the pressure that actually broke the Iranian position was not kinetic, it was Chinese. And that matters because it explains the biggest misunderstanding of this entire war. Iran had spent decades preparing to survive American violence. It had not built itself to survive the quiet withdrawal of its one indispensable economic backstop by the country it had treated as its strategic counterweight to the West. That was the rupture, not just financial, psychological. The shock was not only that money stopped moving, the shock was that China had reminded Tehran the partnership was conditional, and the conditions had now arrived by the 17th of March, according to the reporting that surfaced later. Iran's top leadership had already been forced into emergency discussions about one brutally simple question. How long can the state still function if China does not resume buying? The answer was short enough to terrify them. Not months of flexibility, not a heroic long resistance curve. Weeks before the ordinary machinery of state function began running straight toward the cliff salaries, pensions, subsidies, import financing, the basic fiscal organs of the state. This is why China's leverage worked where American military pressure did not. Iran had designed itself for bombs. It had not designed itself for a Chinese spreadsheet. And once Beijing had Tehran at the edge of that realization, it did the next thing that real great powers do. It translated pressure into terms. This is the part most people still do not see clearly. China did not just punish Iran. China offered Iran a survivable way out of the war, but only on conditions China wrote, according to subsequent reporting. Wang Yi communicated a framework to Abbas Araki in late March. China was willing to restart oil purchases. Chinese credit could move again. Chinese reconstruction support could be accelerated. But those benefits were conditional. Iran had to accept a ceasefire that did not make prior US withdrawal from the Gulf a precondition. Iran had to reopen Hormuz to commercial traffic. Iran had to stop attacks on Gulf oil infrastructure. And Iran had to allow a Chinese back channel to operate alongside and in the decisive phase effectively above the Pakistani mediation track. That was the turning point. China was not just saying stop. China was saying, if you stop on terms we can live with, we will finance the cost of stopping. That is leverage in its purest form. America could impose pain. China could finance survival. And in the last stage of a war, survival money can matter more than coercive firepower. Iran accepted the broad framework on the 27th of March. That means the ceasefire publicly announced on the 8th of April was not the birth of the deal. It was the packaging of a structure that already existed. The architecture was Chinese. Pakistan provided the public delivery mechanism. The American side, for a brief moment, tried to brand the outcome as proof that military pressure had worked. That mismatch between authorship and credit explains almost everything that happened next. When Washington arrived in Islamabad expecting to shape the details of the post-ceasefire order, it discovered too late that the most important terms had already been shaped elsewhere. Iran had already accepted a structure that did not look anything like unconditional surrender. No full symbolic collapse, no dramatic dismantling on the timetable Washington wanted, no easy American victory scene that could be sold back home. Instead, the framework reflected a Chinese logic of post-war management, phased reopening, controlled de-escalation, resumed talks, and a path that let Tehran survive without publicly kneeling. That is why the later talks began to decay so quickly. Washington thought it was coming to negotiate an outcome. In reality, it was coming to discover that one had already been privately sketched, and when the American side pushed back, Iran did something highly revealing. It produced documentation of prior agreement, not with Washington, not with Pakistan, with Beijing behind the structure. That is the moment the political meaning of the war changed, not because America lost the battlefield. American military power remained overwhelming in the kinetic dimension, but kinetic dominance is not settlement control. That is the line Trump appears not to have understood. He mistook battlefield initiative for ownership of the outcome. China did not make that mistake. China understood that in a war this exposed to oil flows, choke point politics, inflation, and shipping anxiety, the actor that can finance the exit can outrank the actor dominating the strikes. That is why the blockade Trump ordered after the collapse of the Islamabad talks looked less like a coherent strategy and more like a reflex. It was the move of a president who had just realized that the result of his own war was being shaped in financial and diplomatic channels he did not control. The contradiction was already visible. Iranian exports did not vanish. They rerouted. Tankers carrying Iranian crude began moving toward Gwadar. The Pakistani port, under long-term Chinese operational control, cargo could be transferred there and continue east under cover. That made direct American interdiction politically explosive. What Washington could theoretically stop, it could not practically stop without risking a crisis with both Pakistan and China. That is why the blockade was loud but not decisive. It was visible enough to declare, it was not strong enough to sever the economic architecture China had already begun rebuilding. Volume started climbing again from wartime lows, still reduced, yes, but climbing. And that climb revealed a deeper truth. China's pause had not been a break with Iran. It had been discipline. Beijing had turned the money off to force Tehran into a framework, then reopened the relationship once Tehran accepted the framework. That is how real leverage looks. Then came the public signals. Wang Yi spoke about freedom of navigation using legal language that deliberately mirrored arguments Washington had used for years elsewhere. The People's Bank of China announced a new yuan settlement mechanism with Iran. Xi and Putin discussed a Persian Gulf security framework centered on regional states rather than external powers. None of that was random taken together. It meant one thing: Beijing was no longer reacting defensively to an American-led war. It was moving forward into the settlement phase and trying to define the order after the fighting. That is the real humiliation for Washington. Not that America lacked force, not that it failed to punish, but that it discovered too late that punishment was not the same thing as leverage. China could offer Iran something Washington could not. A path in which the Islamic Republic survived, remained itself, kept its governing structure intact, and entered a regional order where Chinese capital and Chinese diplomacy mattered more than American coercion. From Tehran's perspective, that was not capitulation, that was survival, and survival is what regimes choose when ideology collides with arithmetic. This is why the real question is not who gets credit for the ceasefire. The real question is who has leverage over the next phase of the war right now. The answer is not Washington. It is Beijing. The future branches into three broad roads. The first road is further Trump escalation. That means trying to smash the Chinese authored framework before it hardens. with more coercion, more dramatic action, more effort to prove that Washington still sets the limits, but that path risks forcing China into more overt support and turning a regional war into a larger confrontation. The second road is quieter and more likely the Chinese framework absorbs the apparent collapse of the Islamabad talks. The blockade remains more theatrical than decisive. Iranian exports continue rebuilding through alternative routes. New talks emerge elsewhere, and the substance of the final arrangement ends up looking very close to the Chinese structure already drafted, even if other actors are allowed to take public vows. The third road is the one Washington is least willing to describe: honestly managed retreat. The blockade is eased or lifted. The American footprint in the Gulf begins shrinking over time. The Chinese-backed framework becomes the operative post-war order. American military prestige survives, but American political primacy in the Gulf is reduced. I do not know which of those roads will win, but I know what this war has already revealed. The real story was never just about ships, missiles, and public declarations. America dominated the opening kinetic phase. China shaped the settlement leverage. And in the endgame of a war like this, the actor that can finance the exit can matter more than the actor that launched the first strike. That is what losing control of your own war looks like. Now, not defeat under fire, not a battlefield collapse, but the quiet discovery that the terms of the outcome are being written elsewhere by the rival power you spent years telling your own public was the central threat. Trump said there would be no deal except unconditional surrender. There is now a deal taking shape. It is not unconditional. And if there is any surrender in this story, it is not Iran surrendering to America. It is Washington discovering that the region it thought it could still discipline is already learning how to settle around it. The tankers are moving through Gwadar. The Yuan channels are live. The Pakistani public track is fading. The Chinese private track is still running. And somewhere in Beijing, Iranian officials are not debating whether there will be a post-war order. They are reviewing the terms of one that is already being built. That is not the end of the story. It is the beginning of the next phase. And the next phase looks much less like American control than Washington is prepared to admit